Hello and welcome to All Things Foster, a place for coffee, connection, and community. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Thank you, Hannah, for coming back. We'll get to you in just a minute. Our sponsor this week is B&I Lone Star Leaders. Business Networking International is a worldwide organization known for referral networking. Members come to a weekly meeting to get to know other businesses, grow relationships, and pass referrals to each other. B&I Lone Star Leaders is my chapter, and they are some of the most giving people I interact with regularly. I love going to our meetings each week and have come to know the members of our chapter so well. If you're interested in finding out more about B&I or about our chapter in detail, post it in the comments below and we'll get you more information. Or check out our website, www.bniwesttexas.com/LSL, or check out our Facebook page. Guys, they are some of the greatest people. Most of our sponsors so far have been part of my BNI chapter. They are so giving to our organization and to others. And so I wanted to just take a second to say thank you to my chapter for just the generous nature that you guys have provided for us, and thank you for that. And guys, if you have a business that's wanting to grow, they're a great chapter, and I think we've passed about $400,000 worth of business in the last year. So they're a great group. And so if you're interested, like I said, pop a comment in the section below, or hit me up, and you can come visit our chapter. So again, thank you to Hannah for coming back to us. Last week's episode was rough but good.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about trauma. This is such an important area for us to try to understand just even the smallest amount with. So just remind everybody from last week who you are, what you do, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So again, like he said, my name's Hannah Doggett. I have a bachelor's from the University of Missouri, Kansas City in psychology. I did a master's at WT, or West Texas A&M, for those who might be listening, who's not from the area, and currently working on my PhD. It's a PhD in psychology, public policy, and law. But throughout my research and throughout the years, I have really focused and specialized in trauma and or suicide. In fact, my dissertation right now is very trauma focused, very timely given just everything going on. I work a lot with sexual assault survivors. You know, I've never been a foster parent, so I will say that. And I'll be honest, I don't necessarily have plans to either. So I'm really just here to talk about trauma and hopefully, you know, provide a lot of information, but then, like we have on our notes, also reminding you all that there's hope. Ultimately.
There's definitely hope. Yeah. So, a little disclaimer here, guys. We said it last week. We're going to say it again. At this point, we're planning on a 5-part series on trauma. And while it might feel heavy and might be perceived as hopeless, it's not. There is a reversibility of trauma. And so our final episode is going to be all focused on the fact that, yes, trauma sucks. Mm-hmm. It does.
It does.
But there's hope.
Yeah.
Because trauma you can't make it go away, but you can reverse the effects, right?
Yeah. You can't reverse what happened or what was done or even really forget about it per se. But there, you know, I mentioned it. It's a really simple concept, but hope. I mentioned it last episode.
Yeah.
That just hope in general can make a huge impact on anyone, but especially those who have a trauma history.
Remind me, because you said something that I thought was really poignant last time about how hope kind of helps with the trauma. Can you remind us what you kind of? I can't remember exactly what you said, but I thought it was really good.
Well, I don't know if I remember what I said either. Y'all might have to go back and watch the previous episode to get it. But generally speaking, and the University of Oklahoma, or OU, Hook 'em Horns, they actually have an entire research center dedicated to researching hope. And that doesn't just apply to trauma survivors, but it applies to every situation, every person, right? If they feel hopeless, that'll have a big impact.
Yeah.
But hope in general, we see can help to kind of reverse some of the effects of trauma.
Yeah.
It really boils down to hope. There's a lot of more technicalities in there about the mechanism of how that helps. And again, we'll get into that in the last episode, but just generally speaking, trauma doesn't define you. It's not your identity. And there is hope for a bright future. But there's a lot of factors that play into that. So.
Yeah. Sure. So today we're going to talk about what we're doing with these episodes is busting myths. Last week we talked about the myth that trauma is just one big event, and then it can be.
It can be.
But it's not only one big event.
Right.
It can be a series of those little T traumas that we talked about. And so our myth that we're wanting to bust this week is nature or nurture. Are you automatically predisposed to having trauma, or is it all about the environment and things like that? So that's kind of our conversation this week, is that nature and nurture make us who we are, and so it's not one or the other. It's not just the environment that you grow up in. It can also be just the genes that you have, right, passed down and things like that. So kind of get into that for us. Let's start with the definition: nature, nurture.
Yeah. So like you said, it's nature and nurture. It's not or. And so nature is essentially our genetic makeup, right? It's what we're born with. I was born actually a redhead, and my hair turned blonde, but I have the freckles to prove I'm still a ginger at heart. And biological influences. Yeah. Nurture is going to be the environment in which you're raised, you grow up in which you're living. And so you have the nature aspect, which you have no control over, really. And then you have the nurture aspect, which as a kid, they may not have control over. As an adult, you have all of the control over the environment that you're in. Yeah. And so that's kind of the difference. In my field, in the world of psychology, for a really long time, it's either or, right? It's either hopeless and it's all nature, it's all your genetics, or there's hope and it's nurture. When in reality, over the years and decades of studies, it really comes down to it is both and.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I remember a story in What Happened to You where I think it was the mom was terrified of dogs because the grandma was terrified of dogs and it went back to slavery and the fact that dogs were used to hunt or to find slaves. And so just the fact that the mom tensed up when there was a dog nearby because that's what her grandmother did, made the daughter scared of dogs and things like that. So there's trauma that happens and we have more ability to control it by what's around us, but there's also things genetically that maybe predispose us to some things, right?
Yeah. I think about a great example of the dog. I think about I have an irrational fear of spiders, 100%. Like I will scream and run away, and a lot of people make fun of me because they just don't expect it from me, I guess. And in my case, it is actually nature and nurture. My mom, my grandma, they all have this irrational fear. So maybe there's some genetic predisposition to arachnophobia. But at the same time, I live in Texas where there are tarantulas that I've run across hiking in the canyon, and I've had a couple wolf spiders in my house lately. I almost just decided to burn the house down. I came real close. And they're huge. And so it's when you're a kid and you see a Texas tarantula, y'all Google that, and be prepared. Those things are huge. So I had also had a right to be scared of. We also have all the really dangerous ones here too.
Yeah. So let's talk. We talk about that it's both, and it's nature and it's nurture. But let's just remind everybody. Let's define trauma one more time.
Yeah, and I plan to do that for each episode, just kind of, again, lay that foundation, then we'll build out from there in different directions. And
scaffolding.
I want to remind everyone I'm not using the definition from the DSM, right? We established last episode that's not my favorite. The one that I really like, if I'm having to systemically or objectively pick one, is the one by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And I'm going to read it from my notes so I don't get it wrong, because I conceptually understand it, know it, but I don't have it memorized word for word. So they say that trauma is any event or set of experiences or events that an individual perceives, which is, again, the key word. Perception is everything, as physically or emotionally harmful and or life-threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effect on their functioning in mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual areas of their well-being. So again, this definition just makes it clear that the impact of trauma is neither time-limited nor restricted to only some parts of an individual's experience, right? And so it could be, again, you're experiencing something over a long period of time or short bursts here and there, but those things can add up too. But it all goes back to how you're perceiving what's happening.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah, the fireman and the kid in the fire we talked about last week, where they're both experiencing the fire. The kid is 5 years old and is terrified and is afraid he's going to die, whereas the fireman deals with fires all the time and he's protected and all the things. And so the same event, two completely different responses to the event. So it's the perception. The perception is what's key.
And what even brought them there, I love the fireman example, because it's like they're going in equipped with the skills and the training and the coping mechanisms to get through that.
Yeah.
The kid trapped in it who gets surprised, perception is going to be completely different of that fire, right? Yeah. Whereas the fireman is like, it's a normal Tuesday at work.
Yeah, right. No big deal.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the genetics of trauma, right? Can trauma be passed down?
In short, yes. And, I'm going to rely on my notes some just so everybody knows, because I want to make sure I'm giving you all the right names and dates for the research articles I'm going to cite.
Absolutely.
I'm really big on empirically based everything.
Yep.
Shout out to Dr. Hambrick and Dr. Kwan, who taught me that way as my mentors and advisors. But it can be passed down, and that really gets us into epigenetics. And so what epigenetics essentially boils down to in this context is that trauma can change how a gene expresses itself. And it does that. There's something called methylation that happens in that process. And so what occurs is that trauma exposure takes place, which leads to, again, alternations in the DNA methylation. And I'm not going to go in depth on what that is, but I don't want people to feel like they're drinking from a fire hydrant, which it might already feel that way. But it is a well-known process, methylation is, when it comes to epigenetics. And then that, in turn, influences gene expression without necessarily changing the DNA sequence. So I think a lot of people, when they hear of like, oh, there's a genetic component to trauma, they're thinking, oh my gosh, something in the gene itself, right? Like something was taken out and replaced, or just taken out altogether, when in reality, it's changing that methylation process, and that leads to the gene expressing itself differently, okay?
So we're not talking brown hair, blonde hair.
No.
We're talking about how it's expressed.
Right. So there are a lot of conditions in the world. I think of Huntington's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disease. Okay. You can only get it if it's genetically in your family.
Right.
If your parent has it, you have a 50-50 chance of getting it, right? And I am not a specialist in that area.
Sure.
So I could be completely off. Feel free to correct me, Dr. Dubutte, if you're listening. But it really is that 50-50 chance if you get that gene. And if you have it, you will 100% get it. There is no off or on, right? So it's different in the case of trauma. There are other ways that are a little more subjective. So think of resilience, right? That's generally seen as something that's more trait-based, more stable across your lifetime. Trauma can change how maybe those genes related to resilience express themselves. So you could be more resilient or less. And that's actually what the research has found.
Wow.
And so that inheritance of trauma, again, it's not hopeless. It doesn't mean that you're going to be less resilient, that you're going to be predisposed to post-traumatic stress disorder or all of these mental health issues. It could actually mean the opposite. And so and that's where environment can come into play.
Yeah.
So there's the nature, and then you've got the nurture. The nurture is ultimately what can kind of, turn a gene on or off at times.
Okay. Okay. So then we've got transgenerational trauma.
Yeah. So this is also known as intergenerational. And so the research, and we'll get into this, I'll go ahead and start to talk about it. The first conference ever I went to in undergrad was at the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. And I was an undergrad and very grateful for the just mentorship that I had. My mentor, Dr. Hambrick, had helped me get to a place in my research where I actually got to present at that conference. While I was there, of course, I'm going to go attend other people's presentations too and try and be a sponge and soak it all in. So that conference was the first time ever I'd really heard about transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. And this is essentially trauma that is inherited in a way. It refers to the impact of traumatic events experienced by one generation. So, your parents, your parents' parents or grandparents, and then how that affects subsequent generations. So your kids and their kids and on down the line. Even if they did not directly experience that trauma, right? Okay. And so real world studies, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit more in the nerdy, so nerd alert time, the nerdy side of me, the researcher. And I'll give you all names. You can actually go and Google these studies and read more about them. So when I attended that conference, again, these are some of the studies that I had learned about related to this. And I've thought about them frequently since. Bauer, 1996. So that's what you would Google if you're wanting to look it up. Name is spelled Bower. Found that nearly 30% of children of Holocaust survivors experienced PTSD symptoms. So keep in mind, these are children who did not go through the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
30% experienced PTSD over their lifetime compared to the control group, which was 0%.
Wow.
So you've got a control group and you've got the experimental group. And neither one experienced the Holocaust. Yeah. But the kids of those who survived it had a 30% over the course of their lifetime, 30% of that population experienced PTSD.
Wow.
And so, again, that just leads into the fact that there is a genetic aspect to trauma. Yehuda et al., I hope I pronounced that right, in 1998 found that survivors of Holocaust offsprings were diagnosed with PTSD, typically reported to be related to Holocaust thoughts or images as their primary traumas. Again, they did not experience, the Holocaust. Yeah. So that's also where the environment then comes in, because grandpa might be talking about his experience, or grandma, whatever the case may be, right? So there could still be some exposure secondary. They didn't directly experience it, but maybe indirectly they're hearing some things about it, and that can still be traumatic for them. I'll go ahead and name these other two studies. I'm not going to go super in depth. Again, this is just so the listeners can look them up if they really want to. Fogelman of 1998 found that children of survivors had problems with communication and identity conflicts, and then more 1990 found higher frequency of separation anxiety and guilt in children of survivors of Holocaust than in your essentially control populations.
And this was, I mean, we're talking 50 years.
Yeah,
later.
so I pulled older studies specifically to show, because I can pull recent ones as well. And in fact, the practice is when you're doing research, you want to find studies that are done within the last 5 to 7 years normally.
Yeah.
Right? I'm pulling older ones specifically to show that this has been known for a long time.
Right.
And just not really talked about.
Yeah, and but these studies were done 50 years after.
Yeah.
So they're, you're at least talking one generation of separation, if not two.
And I could be wrong. I would have to go back and double check it. But I believe one study I read said that the epigenetic aspect of trauma they found up to 3 generations after.
Yeah.
So there's something about that going into the 4th generation where something changes.
Yeah, and I'm a believer, and I see, I stop and think about where it talks about sin being carried out to the 3rd and the 4th generation, right? And that was, that was a long time ago, and so it, I think that in my brain kind of reinforces the fact that the Bible kind of knew what they were talking about, and here we are kind of proving it to an extent, right?
Yeah, we don't really use the word prove in social sciences, right, but you're right. For those who don't know, correlation does not equal causation. I have a friend that actually got that tattooed on her arm because she believes it so strongly. So okay. So the other aspect, the other things that I learned about, so these will be newer studies, was related to 9/11.
Yeah.
So Holocaust, 9/11, Vietnam, those at that conference, those were the 3 big events that I heard researchers talk about, this aspect of epigenetics of trauma and how it can be inherited. And so research on children or women who were pregnant and or widowed while in New York City, that's the key part. So they were there during 9/11. Beebe et al. 2020, so we're looking at a recent study, right? So this is just 5 years ago, documented heightened maternal and infant efforts at engagement with each other in 9/11 versus the control groups. So what that means is essentially they had difficulty tolerating moments of looking away or being separated compared to control groups.
Wow.
Yeah, and so even in their interpersonal interactions, there's differences in how trauma can impact them.
The parent and the child,
yes,
or across the board.
Parent and child specific. Okay. Yeah, that study specifically is looking at mother
because they're so
baby.
Worried because of this happening. There's such a heightened hypervigilance over something happening to the child. Am I understanding that correctly?
That can be part of it. In general, it comes down to, again, how genes express themselves. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but that, especially when we're talking about parents and kids, attachment styles, right? So what happens, what you experience can impact what type of attachment style you have with your parent.
Yeah.
And so in this study, part of that is essentially saying like, trauma impacts the interpersonal aspects of relationships too. So they often found that they were working too hard to make it work. It's almost like they were trying to make the relationship and that connection, they were working harder at it than parents who were in the control group and kids in the control group.
What do you mean? They were just trying harder to stay together as a couple or to parent. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, so there was a hypervigilance, high arousal because of the trauma, and so you have more of this, and it kind of gets into the anxious attachment style of if mom's not in the room, kid's gonna get upset a lot faster and be looking around to see where's mom at, where's my anchor point at, right? And also just trying to maintain a positive relationship. They were working harder at it. Okay. It's like they felt like they needed to put more effort towards it.
Okay.
Again, I was not that researcher, so I don't know all of the ins and outs. I've read that study. It's been a couple years since I have. I'll probably have to reread it for dissertation. Yeah. So that was one of the 9/11 ones. Across other studies with the 9/11 events, we just see these patterns in context. Some of them might be adaptive. So you've got a mom who experienced 9/11. Kiddo didn't experience it, or maybe she was pregnant at the time. And some of those skills, like the working harder at a relationship, could be adaptive, right? Yeah. Some parents are really the hands-off type, but in this situation, I mean, it could be pros and cons to everything, right? That's the CBT training in me, the cognitive behavioral. There's always a pro and a con. So just some of those changes that we see as a result of trauma. There's the epigenetic, which can be passed down. We see that in the Holocaust survivors and their kiddos. Yep. And then you have the nurture aspect, which is environment. It changes both. Yeah. So again, it's not which one is it? Is it nature or nurture? It is nature and nurture, and trauma impacts both of them.
Wow. No. I see. Okay. So trauma is not written in the DNA.
Nope.
But the way we respond to those inputs, whatever the input is,
the way the genes express themselves, essentially, yes. Yeah. So it's not like there's a trauma DNA that you can, a strand of it that you can go in and turn off or turn on. When you talk about genetics and things like I'm not a biologist or anything, but you can go in and actually turn genes on or off in some situations. This is not the case. It's not like there's a gene they can go in and it's labeled trauma and they can turn it off, right? It changes how other genes express themselves. So again, it's not actually changing that DNA strand, right? Everybody knows about the
double helix,
the double helix and that little spiral. It's not changing that. It's just changing how things express themselves.
So would that mean maybe their body would put out more cortisol, or something like that?
There's a joke within my field that anytime somebody asks a question, the answer is always the same. The answer is it depends.
Yeah.
So in every situation, in answer to your question, it depends. Yeah. It genuinely does.
Right.
It depends on the environment that person's growing up in. It depends on some of their past other genetic predispositions. It depends on everything. It could depend in part on their diet, right? Yeah. We know that diet or vitamin deficiency has an impact on mental health too. So yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it depends.
So that's why, number one, it's why it's super important to be learning all the time. But it's also kind of helps us to realize that, golly, there's so much out there, and we need to do our best to understand what, we go back to that again, what happened to you and how we respond to it, and really try to figure out how do we help, how do we move forward, and how do we really understand what's going on.
Yeah. And again, like trying to provide some hope throughout these episodes, given the heavy content and everything. But, over all of the studies, and again, I didn't even bring up the one related to the Vietnam veterans and their offspring. But over a lot of these studies that looks at that transmission of trauma or trauma being inherited, there's evidence that supports that it could increase resilience or that it could increase one's predisposition to struggling with their mental health. So again, it could go either way.
Yeah.
It's changing how something gene is expressing itself at the end of the day. If you're more resilient, that gene, if you're naturally, medically, if you're more resilient, and then you grow up in a positive environment, more than likely, that's just going to increase your resilience as well.
Right.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about early child experiences and kind of the attachment theory, the role of nurture, environment, parenting, culture, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I don't think we talk about culture as much as we should, to be honest. I think everybody thinks of culture as, the US is here, and China and Russia. Those are all different cultures, but we also have our subcultures and mini cultures too. Like each individual family could be considered its own small culture.
Sure.
But when it comes to early childhood experiences and attachment theory, so just real quick, there are different attachment styles, 4 primary ones that are recognized. And I'm not, again, going to go into all of these in detail. You all, I'd encourage you to really look into them because it can help you understand your kids a little bit better. They're secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. So those are the 4 main ones. Attachment theory is a psychological framework that really explains how, and this goes back to early childhood experiences, how that child is going to bond with caregivers. And that bond ultimately shapes our relationships, our emotional development throughout our life. So it's not just how do you attach to your caregiver, it's also what's your attachment style towards your partner, towards your friends, towards potentially even coworkers, right? Are you anxious with your boss, or do you feel secure with your boss? And so that's what it comes down to. But so those early childhood experiences, if you grow up in a home that is unstable, that you experience neglect, if you experience abuse, the chances of you having a secure attachment style, probably not very high.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it, one of the things that I'd learned at some point, I can't remember if it was from Robin's book or from a seminar or something like that, but it talked about how the parent holding the child and making eye contact creates pathways in the brain for the ability to connect. And then, if that didn't happen, that even a 15-year-old would actually benefit from holding them and doing eye contact, because that would create those pathways in the brain that weren't there.
Yeah.
Because, and I don't know the science behind it all. I just know that if this happens, you have the road really maybe to have cars come down it. But if you don't have this, the cars can't come across. But then if you come back and do it later, cars can go.
You're essentially talking about the neurosequential model of therapeutics.
Right.
That's basically what that is.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert in NMT. I've read a lot on it, but I haven't been clinically trained in it. So everybody take that with, what it is. And you can Google that and get a lot of information.
Sure.
He's got a lot of stuff on Dr. Bruce Perry on his sites, and there's a lot of research out there. But that's a lot of what that model looks like is, if when the brainstem is developing, the input that's needed, if it's not provided, we're going to see this cascading effect too on all of the other areas of the brain, right? And so going back and providing an infant with what they needed and maybe didn't get would have a positive impact on everything else too. And so that's really a simplified version. And I could be missing some marks on it. Again, I'm not clinically trained in NMT. I understand most of it conceptually. And I would actually love to see it adapted for adults, right? Right now it's just for kids. And I think there could be benefits in even using it for adults who experience trauma as kids, right?
You want to hold me? I'm teasing.
Let me call your wife real quick, and I'll say, hey, Nikki, Matt needs to be held tonight.
I need some NMT.
He just stared directly into his soul for 15 minutes. Yeah, I'll find somebody to write that prescription for sure.
That would be a helpful one. Yeah, so we've got the 4 attachments, and then so those experiences in childhood influence your attachment and kind of reinforce. We've got the nature side over here. We've got the nurture side. So let me ask this question. It's not on here, but let's say that there's a chemical use in utero. Is that nurture? Is that nature? Is that both?
Yes.
It depends.
It depends. Yes, it depends. I would tend to say it's going to be both because there's a genetic component to substance use disorder, right? We know it as a disease. Yeah. There is a genetic predisposition of those who have parents with substance use disorder. They are predisposed to struggling as well.
Yeah, parents, kids of alcoholics, a lot of them tend to be alcoholics.
Yes,
right.
So there is a genetic component. We know that from research. But also think about the nature component of if you grow up watching your parent come home every night after work and get drunk, and that's how they deal with life, they're teaching their kid how to quote unquote cope. It's I would argue it's pretty maladaptive. Yeah, it's not helpful. Yeah. And so it really. Yeah, it depends. I hate to say it, but it's right. You're right. It depends.
So I'm gonna make a point of distinction here that I'm interested to know if you know anything about. Again, I'm not following our notes.
He's going off script. It's stressing me out.
That being said, one of the things that Robin Goebel talked about, and I cannot for the life of me at the moment remember the person that she follows on that. But what she says repeatedly on her podcast, in her book, in the club and things, is that no behavior is maladaptive. The behavior makes sense. It's not a good behavior, but that it does make sense when you take into consideration what they've been through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think that comes down to semantics on how somebody is maybe perceiving the concept of something being adaptive versus maladaptive. I in grad school for my master's, I had a professor who said behavior is lawful. And what that essentially means is everything you do is predictable. And he broke it down, and I kind of had an existential crisis for a little bit there. I don't think Dr. Bird knows this, but I kind of spiraled a little bit because I was thinking about it, and he's not necessarily wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So, I'm a fairly predictable person to begin with because I like my routine and whatnot. But even deciding how I'm going to get home after this, the direction I'm going to take is predictable. Yeah. Not necessarily because I drive it all the time, but you could think about traffic or whatever.
It's kind of taking away free agency there.
That's why I had the existential crisis. It takes away the idea of free will and autonomy. But for the most part, it's learned behaviors and the things that we've seen and been taught over the course of our life leads us to make X decision at whatever time. And so, it gets back to, again, your answer. It just all depends, which I know is not the best or most in depth, but again, that's kind of a joke in the field. The answer to all of it is it depends.
That's why treatment, there's no prescribed, this is going to work if you do that. Right. If you try this, it's going to work, or that's not going to work. Or whatever, because everybody's experiences, like we talked about it when we're defining trauma, that it's perceived, and therefore how they are going to respond to CBT versus EMDR and all the different things. It's who knows? Yeah, because everybody's different.
Everyone's different. Yeah. For me, for example, EMDR would never work. Never, because I know the science behind it, and I'm not going to ruin it for anybody because my clinical training is if it works for somebody, it works for them. Who am I to tell them I'm not trained in it, so I wouldn't be able to offer it, but who am I to tell them they shouldn't do it if it is working for them? Yeah. Right. We could get into the whole placebo effect thing. Even if it is a placebo effect, if it's working, it's working. Yeah. Right. So, it gets down to, so personally, I struggle with migraines and I have a couple other friends who really deal with them too. And we've talked a lot about what works for us for treating them and being able to get rid of them when we have one. Every single one of us have a different process and have different ways of getting rid of them or different medications. Like one one person's on one preventative that I tried that I had horrible side effects to,
Right.
and then vice versa. What I take to help, she had bad side effects too. So it is not a one size fits all for any of this. You know, I can give you all the research in the world, but at the end of the day, the social sciences is about finding the relationships between things, not trying to prove this will cure PTSD.
Yeah.
For everyone, right? Because that's just never going to happen. There's too much
That'd be
variability.
fantastic.
That would be awesome.
Here's a pill.
It
No
would
more
be the
PTSD.
first time anybody gets a Nobel Prize in psychology, right? The first time ever. And I would love to be alive for that day, but that's just not our reality right now.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so let's talk about trauma transmission through the nurture, right?
Yeah, so this is getting down to the nurture. So we talked about the nature side of it, so epigenetics, how genes express themselves. And this is getting into how trauma can be inherited through nurture as well. So again, it sounds kind of bad because you're like, oh, dang, well, it came at me genetically, and now you're telling me it can come at me in my environment too. Like, again, where is the hope? And there is hope, but
There is.
this really goes into, you know, I talked last episode at the very end, and I'll probably say it again. A lot of this starts with self-awareness.
Yep.
So being aware of how you're approaching your kids, your friends, your family, all of that impacts the relationship and can impact how they perceive you, how they perceive the situation. And so trauma transmission can happen through behavior, language, even silence, and family dynamics. So for any listener for this podcast or in any other situation, think about how are you responding, right? We talk about react versus respond a lot, right? As adults, we should have enough emotion regulation that if we feel ourselves about to react, to take a deep breath, think a little bit, you know, let our emotional side calm down and then try and respond properly, especially to kiddos. So parents who have not processed their trauma, again, so getting back to self-awareness, you've got to know if you've processed it or not. It doesn't get rid of the trauma that happened. It may not even get rid of post-traumatic stress disorder if you have it or the symptoms of it. But being aware means that you can be mindful of your behaviors around your kids, right? So you're not going to go get blind drunk in front of your kids, or, you know, hopefully that's not the most positive behavior. Overprotectiveness, aggression, those are all negative behaviors that could potentially come about if you haven't dealt with what you personally went through. Children are sponges.
Yeah.
I don't have kids. I have one nephew. And I have gotten calls because
Jimmy said this.
Yes, that's. I've gotten. My sister was like, "You're never gonna guess what Grayson said." She tells me, and I'm like, "My bad.
Yeah,
that is my fault."
Yeah.
You know, send him home, and he knows all the bad words. And I'm like,
I remember. Okay, so my oldest was 3, and I say, "What the hell?" a lot, right? And so he goes to the fridge, he opens the door and he goes, "What the hell?" And I'm like, "Oh my God."
Yeah, exactly.
That is me to a T. Like, oh my God, he got that from me. There's no question where he got that one from.
Yes, I got a call one time about my nephew. And I spend as much time with him as I can. Of course, school and work really take a lot of my time. But I was told that he told a teacher, "I do what I want." And he was at the age where the concept of sarcasm and sass, that abstract aspect, he didn't quite get, right?
No, yeah.
And I say that all the time, right? Like I've had people, like friends or whatever, and for example, like my tattoo artist, she'd be like, "Okay, I need you to move this way," and I'd just be sassy and be like, "I do what I want. You can't tell me what to do." Well, my nephew picked up on that, started saying it. I think he was like 3 or 4 at the time, and so again, it's that self-awareness and your behaviors. They are sponges. They're gonna internalize things, right? And you may not even realize it until it's too late sometimes, right? It was too late when I got that call saying your nephew just told so and so that he can do what he wants and not, I profusely apologize, and they thought it was funny because they knew it was my fault. But they're sponges.
Yeah, and guys, we're not making light. These are some funny examples of things that the kids have done, but the point is, kids are sponges, and they're gonna do what they see.
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up in a not the safest home, to be honest. And my sister and I have talked about this at length because she and I have very different perceptions of our childhood. I mean, there's a good age gap too, so that makes an impact. And the way we've perceived things, very different, but we've had really great conversations as adults at this point. And she and I both have had long talks about how do we break these cycles for Grayson, for my nephew, right? Like, how do we break the cycles? And it comes down to us ultimately changing our behaviors or the way we're thinking, the way we're responding or reacting. There was a time that my nephew was over at my house, and I've got lightsabers. I'm a huge Star Wars nerd for those who don't know. And I think last session you couldn't even see my Star Wars half sleeve, but love Star Wars. I've got lightsabers that are impact. They have the ability to actually fight with them. And so we were in my living room fighting with them, and he just barely tapped the ceiling fan above him, right? Barely moved it, but he hit it. And he looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Like, he immediately started to shut down because he was so used to, it's really just grandparents immediately having that reaction of yelling, and essentially saying, like, you're not being careful, you're being careless, and it's like he's being a kid and he's playing. I stopped and I was like, buddy, it's totally okay. Nothing broke. If it did break, I can replace the ceiling fan. It's fine. Yeah. And then I realized we are kind of close to the 65-inch TV. So maybe let's move into the dining room where there's less things to break, right? Yeah. But I could see his face immediately change because he had internalized so much about if he makes one wrong mistake, right? That shutting down and just that internalization of not being able to do things right. And so that stuff, again, my sister and I have talked about how do we break cycles on his behalf? And so he can have a childhood that maybe was different from ours.
For sure. So we got behavior.
Yeah. Language is the next one. Yeah. Again, this can also be used in a family to reflect underlying trauma, right? The way you talk about things. Again, they're sponges. So they see what you do and they're going to hear what you do. Yep. Right? My nephew knows all of the bad words, but my sister and I, in fact, with me, he knows it's all about intention. Everybody has their own beliefs around using cuss words, and I'll respect them. When he's at my house, if his intention is not to try and hurt somebody by calling them, like I told him, if you call him stupid or you call him, pardon my language, a dumbass, to me, your intention is still to hurt that person, and neither one are okay. Yeah. Right? But if you stub your toe, actually, research shows cussing can help to alleviate the pain. No way.
I'm going to tell my wife
that. Yes. Go home and tell her. Not only has research found a correlation between it helping to alleviate pain, physical and emotional, but people with higher IQs tend to cuss more.
Really?
Yeah. Again, I'm not going to use the word prove. It's just a correlation, right? So
I can't wait to let my wife hear this.
she's gonna hate me for this. You told my husband he can say all the words he wants. But yes, like saying dang it when you stub your toe was not as effective as saying damn it.
Really?
And helping to
That's bizarre. How do they test that? Hit him on the foot? Like
I'd have to go just keep running into the wall. That would be great. You know what? Let me look that up.
Let's see that.
Let's see what that actual research, how they experimented that, because that would be great.
I would love to know that.
It's the same with like listening to hardcore metal music, which is my favorite. A lot of people think people who listen to that are more aggressive or more angry. they actually found the opposite. Those people who listen to that
get their anger
have a
out.
correlation of being more regulated and also having a higher intelligence.
Wow.
So
That's insane.
like just a rabbit trail. I could go on that all day long. But so behavior and language really go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Because how you act in front of your kid, you're also going to be talking to them. So how you talk to them, your tone of voice combined with eye contact or lack thereof, right? Are you standing and towering over them, or are you getting to their level
down on their
to
level.
talk and have that conversation? So, for example, a parent who experienced neglect might really struggle with emotional availability because they didn't have that emotional connection when they were younger, which could lead to the suppression of emotions with like just invalidating it. Like, oh, well, that's just your perception and that's not reality. That's not valid. And, I know somebody who is over and over tried to have conversations with their parents about like, I just feel like a burden and that I feel like you love me for what I am and all my degrees and accolades and not just loving me for me.
Yeah.
And that gets back to the fact that their behavior as well as their language showed them over the course of their life that was the case.
Yep.
Right. So it's not all you can say, I love you all day long, but if your behavior does not reflect the unconditional love, they will not believe you.
Yeah.
Period.
Uh-huh.
So
Wow.
again,
It's close
hand
to
in
home.
hand. On the opposite side of language, we have silence, the silent treatment. Oh my gosh. How effective that can be when needed. But for kids, it's just not the best, right? Talking about trauma, talking about anything negative is not comfortable.
No.
Nobody likes that,
No.
right? Nobody wants to sit down and have a conversation about, I don't like how you did this. This really hurt me. Nobody wants to have that conversation. But having that is actually more beneficial than the silence of it, because then there's that one person might feel invalidated in their feelings. So that kid may feel like they're ignoring me because I'm feeling these emotions, or they're ignoring me because they don't love me. So that's like, have conversations with your kids.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing. Get comfortable, with for example, I'll use my nephew again as another one. My sister and I both believed in teaching him the anatomically correct terms for body parts, because time and time research has shown that it helps actually to keep them safe.
Right.
If they know the correct terms. My parents are of the generation of we're going to make up nicknames for him. And, my mom would use like it's his business. I'm like, but that could be taken the wrong way.
Yep.
Right. Anyway, that was a tangent, but creating silence can be really deeply unsettling for that kid.
Right.
Especially when there's been some sort of conflict. So getting comfortable with those hard conversations, teaching kids terms that maybe, again, my parents are of the generation, they don't want to use anatomically correct terms. You just have to get past the awkwardness and be okay talking.
That doesn't mean that it's not okay to have some silence, though.
Right.
I mean, we're not talking about never letting there be quiet, never letting there be time for reflection.
Yeah.
But not weaponizing it.
Exactly.
Kind of,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, because when I think about like, I gave them the cold shoulder, the intention there, and I think it gets back to intention. The intention there is I'm ignoring them, and I want them to feel that.
Right.
Versus what you said, reflection. The intention there is I'm going to take some time to sit with what I'm feeling, with what I'm thinking, to maybe down regulate a little bit if I'm overly activated. So that silence can be beneficial. But it's when we see it, like you said, weaponized. I really like how you put that. Weaponizing silence, just like you could weaponize your behavior, right? So that's another way that trauma can be kind of passed on. The last one I want to get into, and then we'll start to kind of wrap things up a little bit, is family dynamics, which that's just everything, especially I think in foster settings. Unresolved trauma can really impact familial connections. So connections with parents, with siblings, communication, emotional regulation, relation dynamics. The one kid might favor one parent over the other. All of those dynamics can really impact kids. So for an example, a parent who might have experienced loss could struggle with emotional connection, which then leaves their child feeling unsupported.
Yeah.
Right. So we're not trying to blame the parent in that situation. When a parent goes through a trauma, it should be acknowledged too, but it goes back to that self-awareness and taking initiative to process it so the family dynamic doesn't drastically change and that trauma get passed down.
Right.
Yeah.
Man. So talk for a minute, if we can, about the family dynamic of and we may not even have the space and the ability to kind of get into it at the moment. But the family dynamic of, this kid's been through it and now we're bringing them to us, and that whole dynamic changes drastically. And so we have to learn how to modify the family dynamic too, right? I mean, that gets back to a lot of what we're talking about, but we have to acknowledge that things are different, and we have to figure out how to work through it and modify. Not only, when families bring kids in, we have to modify our family dynamic across the board. Let's just say we've got mom and dad have 2 bio kids, and they each have traumas, and we have to modify our family dynamic so that we don't pass on, right? But then we also have, a whole another ball of wax when we've got 2 folks and they've got some bio kids, and then they bring in some kids that have some traumas and things like that, and so the family dynamic changes.
It does.
And that's why I feel like it's so important for us to really. And I'm not saying that every foster parent or kinship family or adoptive family needs to have a doctorate degree in psychology, but we have to understand trauma and how to help the kids overcome it, and understanding and busting these myths. I feel like helps but overcome or move past the family dynamics, right?
Yeah, so with family dynamics, I think about your situation. You had bio kids before you brought in foster children, but your kids were still in the home, from what it sounds like. And so
the first time.
Yeah, I think it starts with having that safety and trust built with your biological children, and open communication, feeling like they can come to you at any point in time. I think it's also important to involve them in the process in some form or fashion, because if they're afraid of such a big change, then you might be bringing in a foster kiddo who has their own trauma, and now your biological child is struggling too. So it starts with kind of everybody being on board, everybody being on the same page, that open communication. I grew up in a family that was, you never question authority, right? Kids should be seen and not heard.
Yeah, you know what my dad always told us? Your mother is never wrong. If she says that grass is purple, it's purple.
Yeah, no.
That I can't tell you the number of times I heard that, hundreds, thousands of times.
Yeah.
I heard that growing up.
Yeah, I always heard the happy wife, happy life.
Yeah.
I would get told, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you a reason to cry. I'm the mom, that's why. Like when I would ask a question, or because I said so, all those things to me communicated, I can't have open conversation or communication.
I don't get a voice.
Yeah, I don't get a voice in any of this.
How I feel, what I'm doing, doesn't matter.
Right. And the times that personally I tried to communicate it, they ended up invalidated of like, well, that's just how you perceive it. That's not reality, when perception is reality at the end of the day. And so the family dynamics start with the family your family prior to fostering, right? And then bringing in, because when you bring in a foster child, you're really just bringing in a box of unknowns.
Yeah.
Right. So you might know a little bit, age, their gender, maybe a little bit of their background, but like you don't have their case file and you're not them. And this is the first time meeting them potentially.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that dynamic is immediately going to change as soon as they come into the home. And I would argue even a little bit before that anticipation of we know they're coming.
Yeah.
And so having that open communication, having a foundation previously established, and then being able to regularly check in with everyone in the family, right? Because that dynamic will continue to shift. And at the end of the day, parents, it's my belief that every child has the unalienable right to being protected and feeling safe.
Yeah.
And it is a parent's job, and it's even my job as an adult and as a mental health professional to do everything I can to make sure that right is protected for kids.
Yep.
And it's hard when the dynamic changes and something happens that seems to go against that makes a kid feel maybe that they're unsafe, and dealing with, because I would never say it's the parent's fault, right? They're trying to help a kid, and again, you're bringing in a bunch of unknowns, doing the best that you can, but it's stepping in, and because it's not if something bad happens or if something goes wrong or if somebody gets mad, it's when. Yeah. And then being able to address it, right? That will continue to change and shift family dynamics, and could even, it will even communicate to the foster child of here are the boundaries, right? A lot of them might be coming from places where they're used to no boundaries and getting to do whatever they want. Suddenly being faced with a lot of boundaries and rules that are meant to keep them safe and help them, to them is going to feel bad. Yeah. Even though it might be helping.
Right. Yeah.
So
let me talk for a second about so my girls were traumatized when the kids left the first time, and we all knew, right? We talk about the recidivism rate in prison. We measure the recidivism rate in foster care, right? And so in the Panhandle, the 26 counties, so the likelihood of a child coming into care, going back to the bio family, what's the chance they're coming back? It's half.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know that.
Within 5 years.
Wow.
Half the kids that go into care, go back to bio family and go back. How often do they come back? Half. And so when the kids left the first time, and it's a whole long story, and I don't want to share too much of their story, but it was a sudden thing, and it was not a good situation. And my girls were teenagers at the time, and it was traumatic to them. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, it was traumatic to my wife and I. For them, it was as hard or harder to deal with that. And so family dynamic is just so important. And like you say here, unresolved trauma can impact family dynamic. And I mean, I know that my traumas and Nikki's traumas have influenced and impacted our family, and honestly, in both ways. Yeah. In beneficial ways. I am never gonna do that. Yeah. Right. But then also, I might do that, and it's as a result of my history. And so, and then we're not saying you have to be completely healthy to foster.
Oh no,
because that isn't a change. Nobody could foster at that point.
Yeah, I was about to say, I would argue everybody's got their issues.
Everybody's got their issues, but we have to attempt to be aware and working through our own traumas, so that we can help kids deal with their traumas. Yeah.
I really think it could be boiled down to emotional intelligence. Yep. Having high emotional intelligence does not mean that you never get angry or you never get upset. It means that you're aware of your emotions and how it might impact or your ability to even apologize when you mess up.
Yep.
Right? I grew up in a family that I think to this day I've never heard my parents genuinely apologize to me.
Yeah.
About X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Right? I could give you a list of things. Instead, it's more of like the guilt trip type thing of like, oh, well, I did everything I could, whatever.
Yeah.
We could go down that rabbit hole all day long. And I feel like a lot of people have that same history.
Yeah.
But, and I've done that with my nephew, because I remember one time I was getting overstimulated and I got really upset. And I didn't yell. I just kind of raised my voice. And I know he's sensitive to loud noises. He has been since he had, what is it, like foot, hand, mouth disease or something that all the kids get.
Foot and mouth disease, yeah.
Yeah, and it since then he seemed to be more sensitive to loud noises. And I raised my voice a little bit at him. And I could tell he got kind of scared and started to shut down. And when things calmed a little bit after about 5 minutes or so, I was like, buddy, I'm really sorry. And I even went through the process of telling him, like, if an adult is being unkind to you, you get to tell them that that's not nice. You can, not that they're going to apologize, but you should always expect an apology from someone who does wrong to you.
We grew up in the same thing. My parents never did admit, let alone apologize for the things that they did.
Right.
And so when the girls were young, my wife would be like, you need to go apologize. I'm like, I'm a parent. I don't apologize. And it became abundantly clear that we make mistakes. We're humans. And we have to repair that relationship when we mess it up.
Yeah.
Right.
And it teaches them that too.
Yeah.
Like you're in turn teaching them emotional intelligence. That's something I had to learn as an adult. Because I grew up in a military family where unless you're happy or angry, every other emotion is invalid and shouldn't be happening.
Right.
And I came to a point where I just realized actually stifling my emotions is more harmful in every situation.
Every situation.
We're human. It's okay to have emotions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Okay, so let's talk about the impact. We'll try to wrap up here. The impact of community, socioeconomic status, and exposure to violence. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so that's just talking more about the transmission of trauma. That's just a kind of another area that you could think about. Those in a lower SES, which stands for socioeconomic status.
Okay.
Let's think about some of the ways that maybe they are predisposed to struggling with their mental health.
Sure.
Okay, so take away the nature aspect, genetics. Let's take away even the exposure to violence, growing up in a rough neighborhood. If you're in a lower SES status, so low income household, what are the chances that you could pay for therapy? What are the
chances? About zero.
Yeah. What are the chances that you are able to eat, balanced meal even, or just get the supports that you need? They're pretty slim, right? And so that transmission of trauma is made even harder when parents who are low income may be very aware that they've experienced trauma and it could be impacting the family, but their access to supports, they just don't have them. Yeah. With community, there's the need to belong theory that really, I would argue, again, I don't like to use the word prove, but that whole theory, it's well validated and reliable. It really just essentially says that humans are not meant to live alone.
Yeah.
And so if you feel like you don't belong in your family, a kid, like a foster child doesn't belong, if they feel that, if they perceive it, no matter how often you tell them that they're wanted and they have worth, that perception is going to impact them. And then we've got exposure to violence that in and of itself is obviously traumatic, right? In fact, in the new DSM, and again, I'm not a huge fan of the DSM, but one of the things they changed is with trauma exposure, they actually put in there, I believe it's age 5 or 6, if a child is that age or younger, exposure to things like violent video games and violent movies is considered traumatic.
Yeah.
And so it's also being mindful of not just where the kid comes from, but what are they being exposed to right now as well? And is that possibly causing genes to express themselves differently or a transmission of trauma in some way?
Okay, so let's briefly touch on the reversibility of trauma because we're going to have a whole episode on it. So stay tuned. Come back every week. We're going to talk more and more about trauma, but there is hope. There is reversibility of trauma.
Which is why I put this in here. Again, we're just going to touch on it briefly. But there's something called neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to essentially repair itself or bounce back, right? There's neuronal death, so where neurons die off, but there's also neuronal growth.
Which they used to, that didn't happen. They didn't think that happened. You had I remember, I think it was in middle school or maybe, I don't know, elementary, but they told us you have the X number of brain cells and you'll never have any more.
I got told in elementary school, if you hit your head, you lose 2 brain cells. And I was like, oh my God. And I didn't know how many I had to start with. Yeah. The amount of times I banged my head in school against my desk or the wall, I would not be able to finish school at this point because I wouldn't have any brain cells left. But there's something called neuroplasticity, which goes into the hope of it, of like the brain has the ability to rewire itself. There are studies of infants who have what are called hemispherectomies. So an entire half of their brain is removed. Now, if you're 65, this isn't going to work the same because neuroplasticity decreases the older you get. Yeah. Early in infancy, and it's most common in severe seizure cases where they remove half the brain. That child, there are cases where the children have gone on to live completely normal, healthy lives. It does not grow back.
Okay.
They generally go through like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy. They have a lot of supports, right, that are given to them, and the brain is able to compensate and rewire itself so that the other half controls the entire body and all of our systems. Now, again, that's not going to work the same as if you're 65.
Yeah, sure.
But think about stroke victims, people who have had them and been paralyzed on one side. The best thing for you to do is to force yourself to use the paralyzed leg or arm or foot. Yeah. Because the brain, even if one part dies off, it can start to rewire itself. So especially in kids, they have more neuroplasticity than we do as adults. Yeah. So if you're giving them a loving, encouraging, supportive environment, the brain can start to rewire the way it thinks and works. Yeah. So that's where some of that hope comes in. And then that goes straight into some of those therapeutic interventions, which if you look up the NMT model, that's what they're taking advantage of at the end of the day is neuroplasticity. Exactly. They're acknowledging that the brain needs to rewire X, Y, and Z, right? So you've got CBT, helps with that, family therapy.
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes, yes.
CBT.
Yeah, CBT. And then just a number of other therapies that can help with that rewiring. But NMT for kiddos is probably my top favorite if I had to rank therapies. Community healing and cultural resilience. That is part of it as well. So the neuroplasticity, you can think of that as kind of nature, right? So that's your brain. I can't go in and physically rewire something in my brain, right? It's going to do that on its own, hopefully. And then you have nurture, which is the community. If you live in a supportive community, not just your family, but you have people and friends, teachers, whatever the case may be, that can help, again, to rewire your brain and help you to bounce back and be more resilient in the face of stress or traumas, big or little t. Yeah. And then I want to talk a little bit about the importance of awareness and storytelling, especially storytelling. Research has found that individuals who tell their story become, it's almost like exposure therapy. Yeah. It doesn't make that story any less valid or any less impactful.
Yeah.
But you essentially get desensitized to it to a point where you're not as reactive or activated when facing it. So it's, in fact, when I taught freshmen in our class on emotions, I talk about how naming the emotion actually takes away some of its power.
Wow.
So saying, I am really grieved right now after you lose someone starts to take away some of its power. That doesn't mean you're less grieved, but maybe you have less of a physiological response or you're just able to process it more.
Yeah, I watched a video, social media somewhere, and it was talking about how we say, I have anxiety. Instead saying, I am anxious about this.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. I don't think it's, I mentioned it at some point in one of my set of notes, but yes, I'll go ahead and mention it now and we'll probably say it again. Especially with Dr. Hambrick, she really drilled into me, so my undergrad advisor, for everything to be person-centered. So instead of saying he's autistic, right, you'd say he's on the spectrum for autism.
Right.
So focusing on the person rather than the label. In fact, that's probably the episode it's on, is talking about labels and dealing with them and diagnoses. But yes, that's exactly it, is, instead of saying, well, that sexual assault survivor, it could be a person who experienced sexual assaults or is that foster kid or that child who is in foster care.
Exactly.
So it's changing it to be more person-centered, which is really beneficial. So it's just that storytelling and goes back to the importance of awareness.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So key points. Trauma is complex, but it's not nature or nurture. It's nature and nurture.
And I'll die on that hill. If anybody calls in and wanted or messages you and wants to argue about it, I will die on that hill that it is both and.
Yeah.
It's not either or. I know there's still people in the field who would argue it's one or the other. I think that number is decreasing significantly. But I firmly believe it's both and.
Because think about it this way. If it's only nature, there's no hope.
No hope.
There's no hope.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're born with X, there's no hope. Like, give up, right? I mean, if you can't heal from and overcome and learn to deal with trauma because you were born this way, do whatever you want.
Yeah, you're just going to succumb essentially to your trauma and let it control you.
Yeah.
And that really goes into, like, I try and put an empowering message there.
Yeah, I like it.
At the end of each episode. And for this one, it's going to be that your biology is not your destiny.
Yeah.
It can dictate a lot, right? Like, it's going to dictate your eye color, your hair color, your height, your ability to put on muscle mass or whatever. But it's not your destiny, and ultimately not your identity where trauma is concerned, and that healing is possible.
Yeah.
It might take a long time. You might be in therapy for years, and that is perfectly okay.
Yep.
In fact, people like myself and yourself who are constantly exposed to traumatic situations, I would argue, should see a therapist regularly anyway, just as self-care. But yeah, biology is not your destiny. So nature is not the only thing.
Yeah.
You have your environment and the people around you.
Yeah. But healing is possible. Healing is possible. Trauma's reversible. We're going to talk about that. I can't wait for that episode. But nature and nurture, it's both. And you can overcome both, right?
Yes.
I mean, and so reflect. Think about your stories. Think about what you've been through. Think about what the kids that are in your care are going through, and seek help. Seek help because it is possible to learn to overcome.
And if you as the parent take that step as well, to go to therapy, to deal with your trauma, like, what does that show to the kids too, right? So I grew up in a home where therapy for my parents, I don't think ever happened.
Yeah.
In fact, the only time I remember one of my parents going to therapy was actually simply because my sister was going too. And so my mom would meet with the therapist afterwards, I think really just to discuss what was going on. And I remember I was talking to one of my parents and had mentioned that concept of emotional intelligence and the ability to sit with people and not invalidate their feelings or emotions. And I mentioned like therapy could actually be helpful for that. And the response I got was, well, I don't think therapy works.
Wow.
And my response back was very reactive. And I said, it's good to know that you think my entire life's work is garbage.
Yeah.
Because that's what I've dedicated my life to.
Yeah.
And I've poured thousands of dollars into my education to understand human behavior.
Yeah.
And I genuinely believe, like, if you as the parent take that step, it will make the kids more comfortable in having conversations about their mental health and seeking help too.
Yeah. I 100%. I talk to my kids like, you should be trying to deal with it now, not waiting until you're in your 40s like I am, right? That neuroplasticity is better, and you're easy. It's easy. I don't know, easier is the right way, but you are more able to rewrite your story in your teens than you are in your 40s. So,
Yeah.
guys, like and share, subscribe to All Things Foster. We're here. We want to get this message out, and we can't do that without you guys getting out there and saying, "Hey, you need to check out this podcast. We're digging into serious big stuff, and it's helpful." And we're not here just blowing smoke just to have something to do. We're doing this because we feel like it's valuable and it's important. And if people don't know that it's here, then nobody's going to know. So, thank you. Please like, share, and subscribe. Hannah, thanks for coming on. Brief reminder, Panhandle Orphan Care Network exists. Our main thing is placement packages. Last year we did 80, which is so about 600 kids come into care in the 26 counties of the Panhandle in a given year. So we did 80, which was the most we'd ever done, which we were excited about. But we've done 60 so far this year, and we're not even halfway through the year yet. Our goal, 125-ish for the year. We can't do it by ourselves. We need folks to help. We need volunteers to run placement packages. And I will tell you, I love delivering those placement packages because those kids, I mean, they just love it. It communicates to them value and love.
Yeah.
We're not just taking stuff.
Yeah.
It's so much more than just some pajamas for them to sleep in tonight. You talk about that community and the impact of having support mechanism. It speaks value to the child and to the parents. We're telling them, we're here for you. We see you. We value you. You are important. We even had coins made that say, I am valuable and loved, so that they can carry that coin around in their pocket as just that daily reminder. Every time they put the hand in their pocket and they feel that coin, I am loved and valued. I am loved and valued. So yes, we're bringing stuff, but it's a lot more than just bringing stuff. So we can't do that without the community around us supporting, encouraging, and building up us. We need placement package partners. $100 a month buys all the clothes for one placement package. $50 a month buys a case of diapers a month. $10 a month gives us one outfit to give out each month. And so, guys, if you're interested, go to our website, panhandleorphan.org/donate. Set up that monthly donation. If you're interested in volunteering, hit us up. Thanks for joining us. Come in. Hopefully you'll be able to join us next week as we dig into... What are we digging into next week?
That's a great question.
Diagnoses,
Yes.
labels, and living beyond them.
Yeah.
Right? And I'll tell you from personal experience, 2 years ago, when I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, it hit hard. And we're going to talk about it more next week. But it hit me hard. And so we're going to talk about the diagnosis, the label, and kind of how we can overcome the label and not identify that that's who I am.
Right.
I am not, help me say it right, because I don't even know. I am not a PTSD person or whatever. I am a person overcoming.
Who struggles with it, and
Right.
and ultimately it just gives you information about yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks again so much to my BNI chapter Lone Star leaders. They've been super supportive of us throughout this since I've joined the chapter. So if you're interested in a referrals group to help build your business, hit us up. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.